Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session of the USC AI Future Symposium. My name is Yolanda Gil. I'm Director of AI and Data Science Strategy at USC Information Sciences Institute and Research Professor in Computer Science. And it is my honor to be your host for this symposium. It is a pleasure to introduce our speaker for this session. Dr. Elizabeth Churchill is the Director of User Experience at Google and was until recently Executive Vice President of the Association of Computing Machinery. She has done a lot of work on the scholarship of design practice and in particular inclusive design, which is a topic she will talk about today. She has a distinguished career in terms of doing research in psychology, AI, and cognitive science, looking at social aspects of computing, engineering aspects of computing, and intelligent aspects of computing, all in the service of end user applications. She received her PhD from the University of Cambridge and is a member of the ACM Chi Academy, an ACM Fellow, and also an ACM Distinguished Speaker. And we are looking forward to hearing about her experiences, not just at Google, but also through her career at other places like eBay and Yahoo, Park, and Fuji Xerox. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yolanda. Thank you, everybody, for welcoming me. I'm delighted to be here. I saw a couple of the talks yesterday and very, very excited to have a conversation with you all through this medium and potentially through email. So as Yolanda said, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I consider to be inclusive design. And this is very much a high-level talk, and it's just some things I've been thinking about how we take all of the great work that you're doing and turn those into those things that you're investigating and developing into great products that are very inclusive for everyday people. And here I put PPS, and at the bottom you can see with the asterisk. I really am thinking not about algorithm design, but about product and platform and service design, and ultimately, therefore, how we design people's interactions with AIs, but also with each other in collaboration with AIs. So with that said, here's a bit of an overview for what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk a little bit about learning from our past. And when I say our past, I mean some of the experiences that we all know about, that some of us may have worked on, that are going well or not so well or so forth, using different AI techniques. And I'm also going to just think a little bit about how we can reframe what we think about when we say AI or AIs. And that really sort of comes from me thinking about how the hyperbole in the media is used in particular, and how we ourselves use certain terms interchangeably, and maybe how we can unpack some of that when we're thinking about design processes. A lot of fantastic designers and researchers have been writing about AI as a design material, AI techniques as design tools. And so I'm just going to channel a little bit of that and really rethink design processes. So we have product and platform and service design processes that are pretty canonical and out there and are taught every day to students and are in practice every day in industry. And I'm just ruminating a little on how we can rethink some of those practices. And in particular, I'm going to dig into my deep past when I was teaching a lot of error ergonomics, human error in this instance, thinking about major catastrophes that occurred when humans were in the loop and how people get blamed or credited with certain kinds of mistakes or errors. So if we think about safety critical systems in particular, there's been a lot of amazing work done on thinking about how systems create the conditions under which humans make errors. And I've just been starting to think a little bit about whether some of those models could be applied to AIs. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about speculative design practice. So there's a fantastic set of areas around design fiction, speculative design, practice, how we can think about the entailments of what we create and what we instill within a product and what the potential consequences could be. So there's a lot of really interesting practice around that, and I'll touch on that a little bit. So that's the overview of the talk. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about was inspired by the email that Yolanda sent me. And she said, hey, you know, we're going to be thinking about when will AIs be one of us? And thinking about communication in particular. And so I was thinking not just about communication, not just about interaction, but are AIs already one of us? Well, if by us as humans, we mean a few set of characteristics I'm about to share with you, I think AIs are quite like us, because like us, they are interconnected. Like us as humans, they are interdependent. We are not individual entities. We are deeply interconnected and collaborative and cooperative. We are social. They're sometimes helpful and sometimes not. And I'm sure if you look around yourselves, we were in a room together, I would be calling on people, but sometimes we're helpful and sometimes we're not in particular situated contexts. We're very diverse. We have a lot of similarities, but we're very diverse, especially we vary wildly in our expertise, in our communication skills, in the ways that we know knowledge and mobilize knowledge. Many people on this call will be incredible experts in areas that people like myself are not. We're very different in those dimensions. We also behave in very unexpected and quite capricious ways very frequently. I'm sure you can all sort of think of examples of that, where people just do something and you had no idea what they were doing and why they did it. I like to think of that whole notion of the uncanny valley, that feeling that something isn't quite right. People talk about that when they're considering interactions with AIs and robots, when you suddenly start to think that that AI, that robot isn't quite acting as you'd expected, a little uncanny. Well, sometimes we interact with other humans, and that is the same thing where you're like, what are they doing? What are they thinking? Humans are notoriously bad, despite the history of psychology where introspection was a major method. We are actually very bad at understanding deeply, without really practicing how to do this effectively, what we really feel and are thinking. I know there's been a number of talks here around emotions and feelings, and we're typically not great as humans at really unpacking some of that feeling and those thoughts. We are also deeply biased, very biased. The literature on cognitive biases in reasoning is enormous. We know that humans are extremely good at certain kinds of pattern matching, but we're biased. So AIs are a bit like us, and we are a bit like AIs. And we, the AIs and the humans together, we're already entangled and intertwined. We're already a hybrid. So this idea of will AIs ever be like us, we're already intertwined, and AIs have a lot of human characteristics. Now, we're not treating AI, typically, not everybody, as that kind of society of AIs, of intermingled hybrid systems. But one of the things I want to say today is that it might be useful for us to borrow from complex systems era ergonomics or from sociological theory to really think around how AIs interoperate with each other and with us. So what does this all mean for the design practices that I mentioned earlier and that are very much part of my everyday? Well, first, we can learn from what we already know. So when we're thinking about, social analysis of people, we typically look at the world around us and our experiences. We have a lot of methods for thinking about how to sample and how to do ethnographic work, as well as experimental work, to really understand what people are all about. And I would say that we could apply that to AIs as well, those sorts of approaches. So step one is learn from design, learn from what we've designed before and what we're experiencing. There are successes where AI applications have been very, very transformative. And there are some unintended consequences and some failures or errors. Now, I don't want to diminish some of the negative things I'm going to talk about, but I want to just say that these are things we can learn from. So AIs in general, in my world, tend to be in products and platforms and services that are used by individuals and possibly organizations. But of course, when we transform those individual practices and those organizations, we might have these macro impacts on society and societies. We have seen that with social media and information in social media. So I like to think of the micro, the meso, and the macro. This idea of we can do evaluation of the impact of AIs through products on individuals, whether it's an autonomous vehicle or a couple of examples I'm going to give. But also we're transforming organizations and organizational practice through really, really interesting tools in the everyday workplace. Many of you have probably worked on algorithms, AIs, that are transforming how we do calendaring, for example. So here's one of my favorite examples. This is from a few years ago. Every single person probably on this call, has one of these. And, autocomplete is a fantastic utility. And especially on our phones and so forth, with like on my fat fingers, it's very helpful. Although we do have some absolutely hilarious mistakes. We know that, but these micro assists are really transforming the way we interact with each other, the way we find information, the way we serendipitously encounter information, but the way we work in everyday practice. Here's another example from a few years ago, which is about, email being transformed. And even these fantastic, amazing, small micro assists, you all know this better than I do. The models are only as good as the data they're trained on. And there was a couple of talks yesterday around ethics where this was sort of brought up. And you know this very well. And here's an example from my own life where when that kind of autocomplete in email was being tested, I was writing to a colleague and I wanted to write, "Hi, Clara." And it came up as suggesting that I put, "Hey, beautiful." It was not my intention. It was a suggestion, and Clara is a really, really, close colleague. And so I immediately told her that this had happened, but I was very bemused about this error. And it turned out because of the training set and because of some of the other things I'd written, I had never said, "Hey, beautiful" to anybody in an email. This is what happened. Now, these humorous kinds of things happen in all of our lives. And I'm sure that, many of you have experienced these kinds of things too. And they do make one laugh. And, that site, Damn You Autocorrect, is one of the most hilarious sites that's been around for a very, very, very long time. But nobody says that actually that autocorrect or completion isn't a great utility. So as we know in our area, Merton, a sociologist from many decades ago, wrote about this around technology design in general. This was long before the internet, and talked about unintended consequences being of various types. There are unexpected benefits, there are the intended benefits, there are unexpected benefits, there are potentially unexpected damages, and then there are these perverse effects that cannot be predicted. So there's no cause, consequence, simple linear model. There's some perverse things that you cannot predict. A great example of this, for example, is seatbelts. So the seatbelt was designed to protect people. There were some unexpected benefits from seatbelts, sure. But when they first came out, they were designed in such a way that people with smaller frames, smaller body frames, were hurt quite significantly. That was an unexpected damage. So anything that we look at, one of the points I want to make is that by using particular kinds of design thinking of the entailments and potential entailments, we can start to think about what effects could be there and be creative around those. So these are all just like humans. These effects are like humans. This is one of my favorite shows. It's a Netflix show called Nailed It. And what they have is they have contestants who are intended to invite to make amazing cakes. And what they actually come up with. I want to share this with you as a humorous moment to say that, you know, humans also bring a lot of biases, knowledge, lack of knowledge, heuristics for creating things. And sometimes we have some near misses, shall we say. And I use dogs and cats, large cats, because we all know the internet is dogs and cats. But anyway, I wanted to just say that humans are like this too. Less humorously, I'm just going to quickly flick through a number of examples that you all know about, where algorithms that meant to do the right thing did the wrong thing, or did things that caused unintended damages or perverse effects. Most of these examples are from a while back, 2017. And the reason I'm using old examples is because I want to really share that idea that we have a lot of data to look at in order to think not just about what went wrong with the particular algorithm and the unintended damages, but also what we as a whole community can do to learn from the past. Here are some more examples. Some of these date back to 2010. Most of these are from about 2017. And they really are around, you know, set everything from sensors to image recognition and tagging. So they're varied, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with these. But, you know, the negative consequences, unintended consequences, potential damages is what we see here. So how do these mistakes happen to us as well as to AIs? You know, us being the humans. Well, that's the question we have to ask ourselves. How do all of these things come to be? And so a few ways that I think we can start to really unpack that is to unpack what we mean by AI and AIs. Back to that point I made earlier around how the media thinks about AI as this monolithic space. So I was on the Noun Project icon site, just looking for some icons as I was thinking about this talk. And one of the things I thought was really interesting is when I put AI in, all of these different representations came up. And they were at mostly micro scales, I suppose, but, you know, are these AIs connected? Is it a central brain? Is it decentralized? So designers who are representing our world concept are also sort of toying with what does AI even mean? Is it like a human? Is it a robot? And of course, many people on the call are going to be much more familiar than me with the history of AI. So look at all of these different kinds of AI, even though today, when people say AI, they really often are talking about networks and statistical models at scale. My past, Yolanda mentioned that I had an AI background, was mostly in bucket 2 here, but I have been working with a lot of people and thinking a lot about bucket 3. But, you know, it's a very varied field, and we do have a deep learning boom right now. But there's all of these other areas of AI that I think we can draw on to learn about the possible impacts of AI and the hybridity of different methodologies that we can bring to really address some of those mistakes, so that we're not always thinking at the incremental moment, but thinking about how that moment fits into the bigger picture. So I just wrote an article, a short column for the ACM's Interaction magazine, Interactions. And really one of my main points was, can we just deconstruct the terms? And as a community, start to educate everybody, designers, developers, you know, the market, around AI as a sort of tools and conversations around different methods and approaches that we can do some scientific forensics upon together. So thinking about what we mean by AIs, and there were some great talks, as I say, yesterday around like language and so forth, but how do those relate to the bigger picture of how products come about? The next thing is to really think about, so we're looking at our past, we're looking at our mistakes and errors and failures. We're not thinking of AIs as anything other than hybrid with humans. And we're sort of thinking about different techniques. Can we reflect also on the design practices and philosophies? Now, my everyday life is about product, platform, and service design. And it has been, as Yolanda said, in a number of companies for a very long time. There's a sort of model of design. Here is an idealized model. And the idealized model, this comes from the design organization in Britain, and it's called the double diamond. Many of you might have heard of it. And there's this idea that you do foundational research and you gain insights to figure out where there's something that you want to design for, which may or may be fully designed or not, or defined or not. And then you broaden out and you come down to define the specific requirements. And then you do some development work, evolution, evaluation, trying to test things out, little hypotheses that you're trying. And then you converge again, and then you deliver a specific solution to the problem that you have identified from your general challenge or set of challenges. Now, this is, like I say, idealized, but there's this idea that iteration and evaluation is built in all the way along. Now, there are many versions of this, and it shows up everywhere. But one of the points I want to put into your minds is that the time frame for this is often quite short and truncated, and it's often very focused on individuals' experiences, the user of the product, platform, or service. And the whole kind of impact on the organization may come out, for example, if we're looking at productivity tools like email, autocompletes and so forth, and suggestions. But often that work of the organizational or the societal is not often done in a very scientific way, even if the micro work of the product evaluation is. So that's one of the issues. Another issue is that often you see here the proven concept, the product is launched, and then the evaluation of the product becomes about usability and utility and key benchmarks. And it's often way down in the future, especially with adaptive systems like the systems that we instill AIs into, we inscribe into, we put the AIs in. Those changes happen way down the line. And so what you end up having is an analysis of a particular moment, and way down the line, there's some set of consequences that people often are surprised by, because the usability and utility has been there. The system has adapted, and then suddenly we end up with a surprise. Many years ago, you'll all remember the Microsoft Hey, which learned hate speech because, again, of the model and the samples that were there. And of course, the hybridity of all of that is that a lot of humans were also very entertained by that, and thus the model adapted within that context of what was pretty hateful but playful. So as we're sort of thinking about those design processes, I've been thinking a lot about what do we do to bring the real scientific sort of principles around long-term potential consequence analysis to really think about what are unintended consequences that could come about. And there's a couple of things I've been thinking about, which I want to throw out there for us to discuss and think around. And the first one goes back, as I said at the beginning of the talk, to my early career, where I was thinking a lot about safety critical systems and error forensics, error analysis. And there's a great model by somebody called James Reason that has been taken up and moved on and moved on. It's called the Swiss cheese model. And this is a paper recently that talks about a lot of the critiques of how that model has been taken up. But actually, I think the original model really does give us some way of thinking. Now, this is a rhetorical framing of thinking about design evaluation around errors. And I don't have a lot of time to tell you in detail, but the idea here is that you have these external factors that get then turned into management factors, that get turned into the production or design process that individuals carry out. And then we have a product, or we have a thing that is being used by people, and there may be an adverse event. It might be an offensive chatbot or whatever, but there's an adverse event. So the trick here is not to think of the AI, but to think about the system within which the AI got produced and got used. So it's a systems view rather than an AI or a person-centered view. And there are various different ways of thinking about this. And this was really a model that was for thinking about human error. For example, this model has been applied extensively within the world of medicine and medical informatics. And here the idea is that, for example, you might have a nurse who makes an error around giving a particular medication. But if you look at the context within that which that nurse works, they may have a whole bunch of pressures upon them, information and documentation that sits within a bigger system, that sits within a regulatory system, that leads to that specific moment of error. Aviation ergonomics is another place where pilot error is often talked about. So we can think of AI error, but think about the context within which that AI or that human operates. And there are two kinds of errors in James Reason's models and the models that have followed on. And one is an active failure where an action was taken, and another is a latent failure where there is a potential for a particular failure, but that only comes about when a whole set of conditions are present. And I think we are learning enough about the kinds of conditions within which AIs fail or succeed, because we have enough examples accruing now to start to actually have a different kind of design practice. And the reason this is called the cheese model is because there's this idea that you have all of these layers like a Swiss cheese with holes. And when all of the conditions line up, you have an error because you have the problem going all the way through the cheese. So I just wanted to share that in case people wondered where it had come from. So these are various different representations of the same thing. And here's this idea of the blunt end, which James Reason also talked about, which is where regulations and platforms sit. And then you have local cultures and individual actions. And whether you're a human or an AI, every single action you take sits within this bigger blunt end picture of all of the influences that lead to a potential latent error. So people are already thinking about this around design frameworks for auditing and thinking about AIs. This is a paper I just read recently that was very interesting. So that looking at that forensics, we're already starting to get patterns of how to do that. Now, if that's looking backwards, here's looking forwards. So the other area I'm really excited about is speculative design or future thinking. And there's this idea in this whole field of speculative design, which is really around design fiction, telling stories of what's possible. If anybody has seen Black Mirror, the TV series from the UK, those are design fictions that are a near possibility. This is a huge area that I'm really excited about. And I'm really excited about building multidisciplinary teams where people can think about the likely state and the desired state and the possible state of what it is we're building. Really spending a lot of time thinking what the entailments could be. We have enough examples now to start to be really creative about considering what those unintended consequences, positive, negative, potentially damaging, could be. The Near Future Laboratory has been doing this for a long time. There's this whole area called Anticipatory Experience, which is not just asking designers what they think might happen, but also asking consumers, what do you think this thing will do? Because if we can get at that, we can start to see where the kind of the uptake and appropriation of a technology may occur in ways that had not anticipated. So I'm just going to wind up now and talk about how this comes into how we design our milieu, our places of production. We can think about the local culture. What is the organization like? What are the pressures on individuals? Who do we hire?
Are we hiring multidisciplinary, diverse teams? What are the infrastructures that we're using? Do they allow us to do a lot of exploration and experimentation? Once we've produced something, do we do enough testing on it with enough people, recruiting enough different participants to try things out? Do we let models run for long enough? Do we do the right analyses? Are we looking at what inequities are created, at how things are appropriated, a little bit like Microsoft's chatbot? How is it appropriated in unexpected ways? Now, doing this iterative product testing and tracing across the longer term, we can start to really think about the positive, negative, and perverse unintended consequences. And so as I wrap up, I want to say that this is my notion of what inclusive means. There are lots of ways of thinking about inclusive design. And there's usability, which is designing for a specific set of people you have in mind. There's universal, which is designing for everybody potentially. There's accessible, which typically is associated with disabilities and supporting people with disabilities, but has been broadened. And then there's inclusive, which is similar to all of these, especially universal. But what I like about inclusive design practice is that it really is a constantly evolving philosophy that learns. And I want to add to what has typically been called inclusive design, the systems and long-term view, critical and reflective and reflexive on our own practice, tracing, forensics, and future thinking, this speculative design and futures design. Being market-minded, but also market shifting. Where will the market likely go? And also having accountability and responsiveness baked into the evaluation over the longer term. What is it that we want to be accountable for and responding to as we go forward? So I'm going to wrap up by saying that we, the AIs and the humans, we're already an entangled and intertwined hybrid, and that we can learn from our past. And one of the things we can do is reframe and educate the world and ourselves about what AIs are and the different approaches and hybrid approaches. But I really think there's an opportunity to rethink the design processes within which all of the innovations that you all are bringing about get placed, within which we understand the potential impacts of what's being built and those intended and unintended consequences over time. And so personally, I'm really interested in this idea of error ergonomic models and this idea of the systems view of error or success monitoring and tracing. And I'm really interested in investing seriously more in everybody being able to think about speculative design practices with multidisciplinary and very diverse teams, and having tests on a regular basis to look for potential course correction or unexpecteds that we can then go back and say, wait a minute, how did that happen? What may the consequences of that be? So I just want to say thank you, take some questions, and I appreciate you listening to me thinking about how in that micro moment, what you're doing and the work that is being discussed here could have really big implications for how we do effective product, platform, and service design in a really deeply collaborative way with multidisciplinary teams. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Elizabeth. What a fantastic set of topics. A lot to think about. I want to invite the audience to post questions in the Q&A window or in the chat window. I will start with a few questions of my own, if that's okay, just as you were reflecting, in part to link to topics that we touched on yesterday. Maybe first, just thinking about these distinctions that you make between these micro assistants and meso and the macro, these different layers. I never thought about that. I guess we always think of designing for a specific individual, but do we need to think about design at this meso and macro levels, or are those more consequences of, when you have a lot of micro changes, then they affect at a larger scale?
Yeah, I personally think that we have enough examples now of how something that was intended on the micro level has had macro consequences. The social media platforms are a particular example where every single action that is taken has sort of ended up, you know, shifting discourse. And I think we have enough examples now of understanding how humans interact with different intelligent technologies and how the hybridity, the human action and the AI action come together to transform collectively an experience. You know, when we sort of think about, when I was at eBay, we did a lot of analyses of making recommendations. I had a whole program called Putting the Person into Personalization. And we looked at aggregate general models versus individual personal models and how you would actually do those effectively. But what we know is that you can shift a whole market behavior around what people buy and don't buy, and you can push products up, or you can, you know, push products into obscurity by a single kind of presentation to a single user. And often in user interaction design or human computer interaction, we're looking at a single user like yourself and how they may react. But once you start to scale that up, you're like, wow, we're really changing the shopping behaviors of a lot of people. And that potentially is a sort of major, you know, ripple effect. I'm going to give you a silly example, if you like. I mean, it's interesting, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, toilet paper all went out. Now, toilet paper, it turns out, was available on a particular set of models because of what people were what the whole market was expecting to be needed. And because of the pandemic, the whole chain basically got held up and shifted because of the pandemic. And everybody went out and bought toilet paper. So suddenly you have this lack because the whole system shifted. And so I think those micro actions of one person buying a toilet roll, if everybody does it, it affects the whole market and the market prediction. Just like one person interacting with something that you have designed, if everybody does it and you make those recommendations, suddenly you shift a whole culture. And I just think we are getting smarter about thinking through those entailments and consequences because we've got so many models when it comes to thinking about AI. And so one might still go ahead and build the product, but I think especially products that adapt, thinking about where those models might go, thinking about the scale it's a really interesting thought experiment, but it might also help us with those unintended negative consequences.
I'll take questions from the audience in a second. I'll go to those in a second, but I wanted to also ask, yesterday we had some discussions about trusting AI systems. How do we trust one another as humans? And the question of risk came about, right? So you make a decision to trust something, you're making a risk assessment of the cost of failure in that operation that you're trusting them with. So you talk about these active versus latent failures, and I wanted to know if you can think of ways to relate those to trust and risk, since I never thought about this, but in fact, why wait until an AI system fails when maybe we can characterize ahead of time its potential or its latent failure rates? Or could you comment on this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that really is the sort of central thing, which is as we start to educate ourselves with these experiences that we know about, we can start to say, well, this potentially is a latent failure because I have seen this go wrong in these other contexts. Is this situation that we're building for similar to or different, and in what ways, to that context? Because I've seen this particular model, this particular kind of way of working go negative over here. So for example, something that may be a risk but pretty benign in the shopping example that I had, in a safety critical system would be a very, very critical latent failure. So, you know, if you're making certain kinds of recommendations about which shoes to buy, it's very different from making a really clear recommendation about which drug to give somebody. So that what might look like a failure or like it's a mistake or an error in the shopping example is a critical latent failure, which cannot be recovered from easily and does harm and put somebody at risk in the medical situation. So I think we can do these thought experiments around the situational context within which we have seen a particular algorithm work in a particular way with, dire consequences, like the, high beautiful example in the email. But if we apply it to a situational analysis of risk of the situation, then we can start to look at trusting in systems and the relative risks that are there. There's some interesting work that's been done. I'm not a lawyer by any means, but I read a couple of interesting papers recently around this idea of risk and the legal idea of risk around reasonable risk that you can put somebody else under. And this lawyer was arguing that we need a different kind of notion of risk when it comes to AI-based systems, and especially when AI is adaptive and under the hood. And he called it non-reciprocal risk, because he said, if two people are acting, there's a sort of reasonable risk. But if a person is acting with an AI system that is invisible, adapting, and dealing with their personal information, they may be being put at risk that they know nothing about, that there's no reciprocity or ability to actually really dig under the hood to see what's going on. So I think there's some discussions even in the law right now around how we define risk and the reasonableness or the reciprocity of the risk under which agents, human and AI, are interacting with each other. So I think we're at the very beginning of a really interesting area of research and development, both in design, but also within the law and around that notion of accountability that I mentioned in one of the last slides I had.
Thank you. We have still a few minutes and a lot of questions, so I'm going to do my best. A question from Christina Lerman. Your vision predicates being able to sense and monitor system outcomes to mitigate their unintended consequences, but measurement monitoring itself is bound by the same limitations. What you choose to measure is biased. So it just moves the same problem up a level, but does not solve it. Is this too pessimistic a view?
Well, I think it depends what you mean by measure and monitor. I completely agree that you have to be very careful. It's like when you're designing an experiment as a psychologist, you have to be very careful what you're measuring. You're absolutely right. But there are a couple of different techniques one could use in my view. One is, I love this idea of, I'm sure you're familiar with this, is the notion of the chaos monkey, where you actually go to intentionally try to break your system. You look at your assumptions and you intentionally, in more of a petri dish and controlled kind of way, you try to go and break the system. So that's one way, which is to measure the failures that you think may be there by actually trying to break the system. So that's one approach. The other thing I think is really interesting is there's this notion of this anticipatory ethnography. So measuring often, as you say, involves a particular set of things that you consider to be measures or metrics. However, if you start to do this speculative design work and anticipatory ethnography work, it's much more of a qualitative analysis of what could potentially happen. There was this great set of techniques that came out of IDEO called body storming. This was specifically around physical environments. But what they would have people do is just act out in particular ways and try to work in situations, physical situations, and really try to challenge all of the assumptions. So it's very much a design qualitative approach. But as with all of those sort of ethnographic or design approaches, you can start to look at where you're surprised. What surprised you? And so what I would sort of suggest is, try and take a viewpoint of not being the person who's designing for a certain thing, but try to go in with a sort of tabula rasa mind and say, what surprises me? Have other people look at what you're doing and have them try and break it for you. So I would just say, broaden the idea of measurement, relax the notion of engagement and how you engage, and try and do some of those serious but playful design practice around trying to break your own system, if that makes sense. So it's much more of a speculative design engagement with the system.
Great. I'm going to ask one last question. Unfortunately, we're almost out of time. Carlos Laufer asks, thank you for your amazing talk and your thinking about AIs and us. It seems to me that AIs are not the villains, but on the contrary, they are an opportunity to enhance us. As AIs expose things that humans just are. How do you think semiotic engineering can contribute to AI in enhancing that path?
Oh, I mean, that's a really great question. And I'm, people have different philosophies, whatever. I'm a big fan of Doug Engelbart, who always talked about augmentation of any technology. So we are hybrids, we are augmenting, and we are extending. And, I don't know a lot about semiotic engineering as a discipline, but I really think that kind of approach of thinking about how systems interpret us and we interpret them, and how we shape each other, which I think is the sort of philosophy, if you want, of that kind of semiotic approach. I think that's really a potential for us to go down. And I think there was a great book ages ago, I think it was Umberto Eco's book, that got given to me by somebody and had been applied in the HCI world by a bunch of my colleagues in the HCI world around semiotics and HCI and design. So yeah, that's a great provocation. I shall go and have a bit more of a think about it. And so if you have particular references that you think I should read, I would be delighted to receive your recommendations.
Yes, I think this is a great note to end with. I often say that I hope AIs will help us be better people, since we are not without fault. So it's a great note to end the session. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Very interesting, very informative. I've learned a lot. And I think we need to think about these effects, the adaptability of AI systems. How do we evaluate that, and the more macro level impacts of the work, the failures? Really great topics. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. And we will continue the session at 15 minutes past the hour. We'll start the next session. Please join us back then.